I stood there smiling. Not because I was happy, but because I was ready. The white dress felt like armor, its silk layers carefully chosen not for beauty, but for the way they would photograph under the cathedral's ancient lighting. The veil, handcrafted by artisans in Belgium, served as more than tradition. It was a carefully constructed mask, hiding the calculating gleam in my eyes that had taken 23 years to perfect. Everyone thought they were witnessing a fairy tale. They had no idea they were about to watch a reckoning 2 decades in the making. The Gothic cathedral stretched around us like a stone embrace, its stained glass windows casting rainbow fragments across the assembled crowd. 300 guests filled the pews, each one chosen with surgical precision. The organ's notes still lingered in the air from my processional, the same piece my mother had hummed to me as a child. Box, sheep may safely graze. How fitting that it would herald not my beginning, but someone else's end. Marcus Blackwood cleared his throat at the altar, his hands trembling as he reached for the microphone the officiant had just set aside. The movement was subtle enough that most of the congregation missed it, but I had been watching for this exact moment for months. His nervous energy had been building all week, fed by carefully planted seeds of doubt and whispered suggestions that perhaps we were rushing into marriage too quickly. The congregation stirred uneasily as he lifted the microphone to his lips. This wasn't part of the script they expected, wasn't in the wedding program that had cost me $3,000 to design and print on handmade paper. But it was exactly what I had spent 18 months orchestrating. His announcement cut through the cathedral's hallowed silence like a blade through silk. The words tumbled out in the rehearsed cadence I had heard him practicing in our bathroom mirror for the past week, though he believed I was asleep. Gasps rippled through the pews like stones thrown into still water, followed by the rustle of expensive fabric as 300 bodies shifted in shock. I kept smiling. Not the devastated, humiliated expression of a woman whose world had just crumbled in front of everyone she knew, but something else entirely. Something that made Marcus's confident smirk falter for just a moment before he remembered his lines. The photographers I had hired, 3 of the city's most sought-after wedding photographers, continued capturing every moment. Their cameras clicked like a mechanical heartbeat, preserving each expression, each reaction, each perfectly choreographed second of what would become the most documented reckoning in the city's social history. My response echoed through the cathedral with the clarity that 4 years of speech therapy had given me. Those sessions, officially to polish my courtroom presence, had actually been preparation for this single moment. Every word carried the weight of 2 decades of careful planning. Richard Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in the front row, his Italian leather shoes squeaking against the marble floor. Exactly where I had placed him during the seating arrangement meetings that had driven the wedding planner to distraction. Right next to the woman he thought he had erased from existence 23 years ago. The woman whose presence here represented the culmination of the most expensive missing persons investigation in private detective history. The woman who was my mother. People assumed I was hopelessly romantic for insisting on handwritten invitations, for personally selecting every seat, for obsessing over details that seemed meaninglessly sentimental. The wedding planner, Vivian Chun, no relation to Detective Sarah Chun, though the name similarity had been one of those cosmic coincidences that felt like fate, had initially found my attention to detail charming. By month 6 of planning, she called me her most demanding client ever. She didn't realize I was an architect, and this was my masterpiece. The guest list had taken 3 years to compile. Each name represented months of research, private investigators, public record searches, and social engineering that would have impressed the FBI. I had become an expert at striking up conversations at charity galas, at remembering anniversaries and children's names, at making myself indispensable to the social circles that orbited around the Blackwood family's considerable gravity. Row by row, I had positioned them like chess pieces in a game that had been 23 years in the making. The front section held Marcus's business partners, men who had invested millions based on his father's sterling reputation and the family name that opened doors throughout the city's financial district. They sat in their $1,000 suits, checking Rolexes that cost more than most people's cars, completely unaware that their portfolios were about to become worthless. The third row contained the Hendersons, their silver hair and lined faces marking them as survivors of griefs that had aged them beyond their years. Their daughter Sarah had disappeared during a family camping trip 23 years ago. Her body found 3 days later on a stretch of highway 30 miles from their campsite. The coroner had ruled it a hit and run, but the case had gone cold when the investigation mysteriously stalled after 2 weeks. Detective Sarah Chun occupied an aisle seat in the fifth row, her retired status carefully researched and verified. She had worked the Henderson case, among dozens of others, but that particular file had haunted her throughout her 30-year career. I knew this because I had spent 6 months carefully cultivating a friendship with her daughter, learning family stories over coffee dates and book club meetings. Scattered throughout the cathedral were insurance investigators, journalists, former employees of Blackwood Industries, and family members of a dozen unsolved cases that had one thread in common. They had all been mysteriously closed or transferred just as they were gaining momentum. And in the very back, almost hidden behind a Gothic pillar that had stood for 800 years, sat Mrs. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had been paid $50,000 to disappear in 1987. The woman who had spent 23 years believing her daughter thought she had been abandoned. The woman whose false death certificate I had discovered buried in a filing cabinet in the basement of a defunct private investigation firm. The woman who was my mother. I was 5 when my mother vanished from our small apartment above the bakery on Morrison Street. The police report, which I had memorized word by word by the time I turned 18, described it as abandonment. A young woman overwhelmed by single motherhood and crushing debt, running away to start fresh somewhere her past couldn't follow her. But children remember things adults think they forget, and I had the kind of memory that stored details like a vault stores treasures. I remembered the progression of bruises on my mother's arms after she started her cleaning job at the Blackwood Mansion, how she would wear long sleeves even in the suffocating heat of summer. I remembered her crying after late-night phone calls, the way she would press the receiver against her ear and write numbers on scraps of paper that she would burn in the kitchen sink afterward. I remembered the night she sat on my bed, stroking my hair with hands that shook despite her attempts to keep them steady. She had packed my few belongings into a cardboard suitcase decorated with cartoon characters, explaining in a voice too calm for the tears on her cheeks that she had to go away for a while, that someone would take care of me, someone safe, until she could come back. The someone had been Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who became my legal guardian through paperwork that I would later discover had been expedited through legal channels that should have taken months. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been paid $20,000 to keep me quiet about the details of my mother's disappearance. Mrs. Rodriguez, who genuinely loved me, but who took that secret to her grave when I was 16. I remembered my mother's promise, spoken in Spanish because she said some truths were too important for English. The language of her grandmother, of prayers and lullabies and the deepest loves of her heart. The truth always finds a way, she had whispered. Always. For 18 years, I believed she had lied. My transformation from abandoned child to architect of justice had been methodical, expensive, and utterly consuming. Every choice I made after turning 18 served the singular purpose of positioning myself to uncover what had really happened to Elena Vasquez. The scholarship to Northwestern hadn't been luck. It had been the result of a carefully crafted essay about overcoming abandonment issues, supported by recommendation letters from teachers I had cultivated specifically for their connections to the university's admissions board. My major in journalism, with a minor in criminal justice, seemed like natural choices for someone interested in investigative reporting, but they were actually tools I needed to learn how to excavate buried truths. Law school at Georgetown followed, funded by student loans that would take me 30 years to repay, and a job waiting tables at the kind of restaurant where politicians and businessmen held meetings they thought were private. I learned to become invisible while serving their food, to remember conversations that were never meant to be overheard, to recognize the names and faces of people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. My thesis on prosecutorial misconduct in cold cases wasn't academic curiosity. It was a roadmap for understanding how cases disappeared, how evidence vanished, how witnesses could be convinced to change their testimonies or relocate to other states. The private investigator's license I earned after graduation seemed like a natural extension of my legal education, but it gave me access to databases and resources that civilians couldn't touch. More importantly, it connected me to a network of retired cops, insurance investigators, and forensic accountants who had spent their careers watching guilty people walk free on technicalities. Marcus Blackwood entered my life during my second year of practice when I was working for a small firm that specialized in insurance fraud. He was charming, handsome, and heir to a fortune built on real estate development and municipal contracts. Our meeting at a charity gala seemed accidental. I had spilled wine on his $1,000 tuxedo and insisted on paying for the cleaning. He had no idea that I had researched his schedule for 6 months, that I knew he always ordered the salmon at charity events, that he had a weakness for brunettes with law degrees and complicated family histories. He certainly didn't know that I had practiced that wine spill for weeks, timing it to coincide with the exact moment when the auction would end, and he would be most receptive to distraction. Our courtship lasted 3 years. 3 years of carefully orchestrated romance, of making myself indispensable to his social circle, of becoming the kind of woman his mother approved of and his father trusted. 3 years of gathering intelligence, copying files, and building relationships with everyone in the Blackwood family's orbit. 3 years of falling in love with my own performance while never forgetting why I was giving it. The first breakthrough came during year 2 of dating Marcus, when I volunteered to help organize his father's 70th birthday party. The theme was a life well lived, and I convinced the family to create a timeline of Richard's achievements using photographs and documents from the family archives. Those archives, stored in climate-controlled cabinets in the basement of the Blackwood mansion, contained 40 years of business records, personal correspondence, and legal documents. While upstairs, the party planners arranged flowers and the caterers prepared for 300 guests, I spent hours alone with the carefully preserved evidence of Richard Blackwood's life. The insurance policy for his 1987 Mercedes had been replaced 3 days after my mother's disappearance. The bodywork invoice showed extensive front-end damage, repaired at a shop that had closed permanently 6 months after the work was completed. The owner, according to public records, had retired to Costa Rica with enough money to buy a beach house and never work again. The bank records showed a $50,000 withdrawal on the same day my mother vanished, followed by a series of smaller payments to accounts registered to entities that existed only on paper. Shell companies, I learned during my investigation, that had been dissolved within a year of their creation. But the most damning evidence was a letter, written in Richard's careful handwriting and never sent, buried among business correspondence from 1987. It was addressed to a Catholic church in Phoenix, inquiring about adoption services for a 5-year-old girl whose mother had died in an accident. The letter described me by name, mentioned my address, and included a cashier's check for $10,000 to cover placement fees. He had planned to make me disappear too. The only thing that had saved me was Mrs. Rodriguez's interference. She had already filed emergency custody papers before Richard could implement his plan, using connections to legal aid attorneys who specialized in protecting children from exactly this kind of situation. Her $20,000 payment hadn't been a bribe. It had been reimbursement for legal fees and a promise to keep me safe. The second breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Sarah Chin, recently retired and finally free to speak about cases that had frustrated her for decades, had started a blog called Cold Justice. Her posts about unsolved hit-and-runs included details that had never been released to the public, including information about a witness who had initially come forward in the Henderson case but had recanted her testimony and moved out of state. The witness description matched my mother perfectly. Finding Elena Vasquez after 23 years required resources that consumed my entire savings and forced me to mortgage the small condo I had purchased with my first attorney's salary. Private investigators in 7 states, database searches that cost hundreds of dollars per query, and facial recognition software that existed in legal gray areas. She was living in Phoenix under the name Elena Martinez, working as a house cleaner for wealthy families in Scottsdale. She had never remarried, never had other children, and according to the social worker who had been monitoring her for the Arizona Department of Family Services, she lit a candle every year on my birthday and told anyone who would listen about the daughter she had been forced to abandon. The reunion happened in a coffee shop near her apartment, chosen specifically because it was public enough to feel safe but private enough for the conversation we needed to have. She recognized me immediately despite the decades that had passed, her hand flying to her mouth as she whispered my childhood nickname in Spanish. Her story filled in the gaps that 20 years of investigation had left empty. She had witnessed Richard Blackwood's Mercedes strike Sarah Henderson on that stretch of highway, had written down the license plate number, and had gone to the police with information that should have solved the case immediately. Instead, she had been visited by men who explained that her immigration status was questionable, that her employer had reported suspicious behavior, and that her young daughter might be better off in the care of people who could provide stability and proper documentation. The $50,000 had been presented as generosity, not bribery, money to help her start fresh somewhere new, far from complications that could hurt us both. She had taken the money because she believed it would keep me safe. She had stayed away because she believed the threats were real. And she had grieved for 23 years because she believed I hated her for leaving. The truth, as she had promised all those years ago, had finally found its way. Convincing Marcus to propose required a delicate balance of encouragement and resistance that would have impressed a behavioral psychologist. Too eager, and he would have suspected ulterior motives. Too reluctant, and he might have moved on to someone easier to pursue. The proposal came during a weekend trip to Napa Valley, in a vineyard that belonged to one of his father's business partners. He had chosen the location specifically because it represented everything the Blackwood family valued: tradition, wealth, and connections that stretched back generations. The ring, a 5-carat diamond in a setting that had belonged to his grandmother, came with a story about family legacy and the importance of choosing a partner who understood the responsibilities that came with the Blackwood name. I accepted with tears of joy that were only partly performance. Despite everything I knew about his family, despite the careful calculation that had brought us to this moment, I had developed genuine feelings for Marcus. He was kind, intelligent, and completely unaware of the crimes that had built his privileged life. In another universe, where justice had been served decades ago, we might have had a real chance at happiness. But this wasn't another universe, and some debts could only be paid in public. The wedding planning consumed 18 months of my life and nearly every favor I had accumulated during 5 years of cultivating the city's social elite. The venue required a waiting list that typically stretched 3 years, but a carefully timed donation to the cathedral's restoration fund had opened a cancellation slot. The catering contract went to a company owned by the family of one of Richard's former employees, a man who had been fired for asking too many questions about municipal contracts that seemed designed to benefit Blackwood Industries. Every vendor, every service provider, every person involved in creating our perfect day had been chosen for their connection to the broader story I was preparing to tell. The florist was the sister of a city planner who had been demoted after refusing to approve a Blackwood project that violated environmental regulations. The musicians included the daughter of a contractor who had been blacklisted from municipal projects after complaining about substandard materials on a Blackwood construction site. Most importantly, the guest list became a carefully curated collection of everyone who had been affected by Richard Blackwood's 40-year career of buying silence and burying truth. Some came because they were friends of the family. Others came because they were enemies who wanted to witness what they assumed would be a celebration of everything they despised. None of them realized they were coming to a funeral. Marcus was still stammering through his prepared breakup speech when I walked down from the altar, my heels clicking against the marble with deliberate precision. Each step had been practiced, timed to build dramatic tension while giving the photographers opportunities to capture the reactions spreading through the congregation like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The folder hidden beneath my bridal bouquet contained 20 years of investigation compressed into 300 pages of documentation. Bank records showing suspicious transfers. Private investigator reports detailing witness intimidation. Police files that had mysteriously gone missing from evidence rooms, only to reappear in the personal collection of a retired detective who had kept copies because he knew someone would eventually need them. Medical examiner reports that had been altered. Insurance claims that had been approved without investigation. Municipal contracts awarded to companies that existed only on paper, their profits flowing through shell corporations back to accounts controlled by Richard Blackwood. And at the center of it all, the story of a 19-year-old college student who had been walking home from her job at a campus bookstore when a drunk driver in a Mercedes had struck her and left her to die on a dark stretch of highway. The cathedral erupted as I revealed each piece of evidence, my voice carrying the authority that 4 years of courtroom experience had taught me to project. This wasn't the emotional outburst of a jilted bride, it was a prosecutor's closing argument, delivered to a jury of 300 people who represented every aspect of the city's power structure. Richard tried to stand, tried to leave, but Detective Sarah Chin had positioned herself strategically near the main exit. Her retirement was real, but her commitment to justice had never wavered. The evidence I had uncovered over 20 years of investigation had been shared with her months ago, along with a promise that this day would provide the perfect opportunity to make arrests that had been 23 years overdue. Marcus looked between his father and me with the dawning understanding of someone who had just realized their entire life was built on a foundation of lies. the man he had idolized, the family name he had been proud to carry, the fortune that had given him every advantage. All of it was purchased with blood and maintained through terror. The business partners were already calculating losses, pulling out phones to call lawyers and accountants who would spend the next year unwinding investments and partnerships that were about to become toxic. The Hendersons were crying, but their tears were relief as much as grief. Finally, after 23 years, someone was going to answer for their daughter's death. The insurance investigators were taking notes, recognizing patterns they had suspected but never been able to prove. The journalists were recording everything, understanding that they were witnessing the kind of story that would define their careers. And my mother, my brave, broken, beautiful mother, stood up from her seat in the back row and walked forward to speak the truth that had been buried for 2 decades. The wedding that never was became the trial of the decade, dominating headlines for 18 months as prosecutors untangled a web of corruption that stretched back 40 years. Richard Blackwood, pillar of the community and philanthropist whose name adorned hospital wings and scholarship funds, was sentenced to life in prison for murder, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other charges that unraveled like thread pulled from cheap fabric. The evidence I had gathered formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, but it was my mother's testimony that sealed his conviction. 23 years of living with the truth had prepared her to speak with a clarity that cut through every defense attorney's attempt to discredit her. She had seen Richard Blackwood's Mercedes strike Sarah Henderson. She had written down the license plate number. She had tried to do the right thing and had been terrorized into silence. Her testimony led to the reopening of 17 other cold cases, each one revealing another instance where Richard's money and influence had perverted justice. Investigators, prosecutors, and city officials who had taken his bribes were arrested in waves that cleaned out entire departments and led to the largest municipal corruption scandal in the state's history. Marcus lost everything that mattered to him. The trust fund that had supported his lifestyle was frozen pending civil litigation from victims' families. The business connections that had opened doors throughout his life disappeared overnight as everyone distanced themselves from the Blackwood name. The social circles that had defined his identity wanted nothing to do with the son of a convicted murderer. Last I heard, he was working at a car dealership in Nevada, using his mother's maiden name and trying to understand how completely he had been outmaneuvered by the woman he had planned to humiliate at the altar. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions redistributed the Blackwood fortune to 17 families who had been denied justice for decades. The Hendersons used their settlement to establish a foundation that provided legal aid to families of hit-and-run victims. Detective Chun came out of retirement to consult on cold cases across the country. The insurance companies that had paid fraudulent claims recovered millions in settlements that would fund investigations into similar schemes nationwide. But the most satisfying outcome was personal. Mrs. Rodriguez had left me a letter, sealed and held in trust by her attorney, to be delivered only if my mother was ever found alive. In careful handwriting that took me back to childhood, she explained that she had never stopped looking for Elena, that she had hired private investigators with her own savings, and that she had always believed the day would come when our family would be whole again. She had been right. I disappeared after the trial ended, liquidating bank accounts, selling property, and leaving no forwarding address. The press assumed it was a breakdown, that the weight of orchestrating such elaborate revenge had finally crushed the woman who had spent her adult life preparing for one perfect moment of justice. They were wrong, but I let them believe it. The year I spent in anonymity was the most productive of my life. Using connections I had made during 20 years of investigation, I assembled a team of documentary filmmakers who specialized in true crime stories that exposed systemic corruption. The footage from my wedding provided the dramatic centerpiece, but the real story was the investigation that had led to that moment. The Wedding Planner: How I Brought Down a Killer premiered at Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and reviews that called it a masterpiece of investigative journalism. Netflix acquired distribution rights for 8 figures, making it one of the highest-grossing documentaries in the platform's history. But more importantly, it inspired dozens of other victims to come forward with stories of cases that had been buried, investigations that had been abandoned, and families that had been terrorized into silence. The documentary won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, but I wasn't at the ceremony to accept it. Instead, I was in Phoenix, working with my mother to establish the Elena Vasquez Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases involving witness intimidation and prosecutorial corruption. Our first case came from a letter sent by a viewer of the documentary, a woman whose sister had been murdered 15 years earlier, whose killer had been identified but never prosecuted because of connections to a prominent political family. Within 6 months, we had gathered enough evidence to reopen the investigation and secure an indictment that had been blocked for over a decade. The foundation now employs 12 full-time investigators, maintains relationships with retired law enforcement officials in 30 states, and has helped secure convictions in 47 cases that had been considered unsolvable. We specialize in crimes where money and influence have perverted justice, where victims' families have been ignored or intimidated into silence, where the truth has been buried under layers of corruption that seem impenetrable. We are very good at what we do. My mother and I work together now in ways we never could when I was a child. She has a gift for gaining the trust of witnesses who have been too frightened to speak, a gentleness that comes from her own experience of being silenced and ignored. I provide the legal framework and investigative resources that turn their stories into prosecutable cases. Detective Sarah Chun joined our foundation as senior consultant, bringing with her 40 years of experience and a network of contacts throughout law enforcement. She adopted me officially last year, a legal formality that made real the family bond we had developed over months of working together. My name is now Isabella Vasquez Chin, carrying both my mother's identity and the woman who helped restore it. The foundation operates from a converted warehouse in Phoenix, chosen specifically because Arizona's public records laws make it easier to access the kind of historical documents that form the backbone of our investigations. Our offices are deliberately modest. We've learned that victims are more likely to trust people who don't live in marble towers. But the real work happens in the field, in coffee shops and living rooms where people finally feel safe enough to tell the truth they've been carrying for years. We've learned that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that some truths are worth waiting decades to uncover, and that the systems designed to protect the powerful are not as impenetrable as they appear. The wedding dress hangs in my closet still, preserved in acid-free tissue paper and climate-controlled storage. Not as a memento of revenge, but as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful performances are the ones where the ending surprises everyone, including the performers themselves. I think about Marcus sometimes, wonder if he's found peace in his reduced circumstances, if he's learned to build an identity that doesn't depend on money stolen from victims' families. I hope he has, because despite everything, I remember the man I fell in love with during those 3 years of careful courtship. He was a victim too, in his way, raised to believe that privilege was his birthright instead of understanding that it was purchased with other people's suffering. But mostly I think about the future, about the cases that fill our files and the families who trust us with their deepest griefs. The truth always finds a way. My mother promised me when I was 5 years old, and she was right. Sometimes it just needs a little help. The foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined that day I stood at the altar in a white dress that felt like armor. We now have offices in 12 states, partnerships with law enforcement agencies nationwide, and a staff of 60 investigators, attorneys, and victim advocates who share our commitment to uncovering buried truths. The documentary sparked a movement that has transformed how cold cases are investigated, leading to legislation that makes it harder for evidence to disappear and witnesses to be intimidated into silence. The Blackwood laws, named for the case that started it all, require independent oversight for any investigation involving suspects with significant wealth or political connections. My mother celebrated her 70th birthday last month, surrounded by the extended family we've built from colleagues, survivors, and the dozens of people whose lives we've touched through our work. She still lights a candle every year on the anniversary of Sarah Henderson's death, but now it's a memorial rather than a prayer for justice that may never come. Richard Blackwood died in prison 3 years ago, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the cost of believing that money can buy anything, including silence. His obituary mentioned his conviction before it mentioned his business achievements, ensuring that future generations would remember him for what he truly was rather than what he pretended to be. I never married. Not because I swore off love after what happened with Marcus, but because the work consumes everything I have to give. There are too many victims who need someone to care about their cases, too many families who deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones, too many powerful people who still believe they can commit crimes without consequences. But I'm not alone. The family I've built from choice rather than circumstance fills my life with purpose and connection that I never experienced as a child. We've learned that justice is not a destination but a journey, one that requires constant vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power even when that power seems insurmountable. The girl who stood at that altar 10 years ago, smiling because she was ready, has become a woman who smiles because she knows that truth always finds a way. Always. And sometimes, when the light hits the wedding dress in my closet just right, I remember that the most perfect performances are the ones that end not with applause, but with justice. The truth always finds a way. We just make sure it has the right address.